The largest manufacturer of railway infrastructure in Victoria was the once mighty Newport workshops, until it was eventually made obsolete. Fortunately, it still survives today, and it has had a long journey to get here. In today's video, I'm going to tell you all about it. This is the history of Newport workshops and others. This isn't the Newport workshops I know. Well, it was all because of this tiny temporary workshop in Williamstown that Newport could exist today. This was the former Williamstown workshops, built in 1859, today at the site of Point Gellibrand Coastal Heritage Park. The workshops were very small, being made up of 5 temporary buildings, with Victorian railways wanting to expand in future. The workshops were mainly used to assemble engines imported from England, and not actually manufacture them. Soon other buildings were added to the site, and the workshops were able to manufacture engines. But 7 was all they built. The first of these, number 100, a 240 passenger engine in 1872. This type of engine would be later classified as the old E-class. Plans for a major expansion were being considered as early as 2 years after Williamstown opened. They would stay as considerations until the early 1880s. Williamstown was described as overcrowded and cramped, so a new workshop opened at Newport, with Williamstown being closed in 1889. Nothing remains on the site today. Literally, nothing remains. Work began on Newport in 1880, with annexes from the 1880 Melbourne exhibition, which VR converted one of them to be used as a small carriage workshop, dubbing them Newport Carriage Works, on the current site. The carriage workshops began operation in 1892, although the buildings weren't permanent. A permanent workshop commenced construction in 1884, and opened in 1889. By the time the permanent location was opened, the carriage works were long gone. Instead, they were converted to manufacture signalling equipment. The first carriages were built and the new workshops were completed that same year, in 1889. Although, locomotives were shared with outside contractors, such as the Phoenix Foundry in Ballarat. The first locomotive to be fully built in-house in Newport was a small 240 Z-class, Z526, named Polly. It still survives today at Science Works. The workshops were divided into segments to manufacture different things. The site is still in segments today, but the segments just have different roles now. Formerly the East Block was the carriage and wagon works, and the West Block was for heavy engineering and locomotive building, the good bit. Newport workshops experienced growth spurts from 1905 to 1915 and 1925 to 1930, where it was expanded further around the site. During World War II, the workshops were turned over to the military and used to produce their equipment, with the rear fuselage and empennage of Bristol Buford bombers being produced, just to name a few. At the peak of operation, it was the largest and best equipped engineering plant in Victoria, with about 5,000 employees on site. Of course, when the employees were on their lunch break, they would get bored. So, the site also contained a cricket field. Newport also had anything and everything to manufacture locomotives. You name it, they got it. The list goes: erecting shop where locomotives were built and repaired, a boiler plant where boilers were made, a foundry which locomotive parts, brake blocks, signaling equipment, luggage racks, and miscellaneous infrastructure were built, a laboratory where chemists and engineers tested all the products used on locomotives, and, of course, an ambulance room. On average, the nurse would see about 65 men a day. In the early 50s, VR had no more use for the workshops, as most of their newer diesels were built at Clyde Engineering in New South Wales. The final locomotive at the workshops was a diesel hydraulic M-Class M232 in 1959, which still resides at the workshops today, with a total of 500 locomotives being built at the workshops over a 70-year span. In the late 80s, the original sections were removed from everyday use, with regular operations continuing in the newer eastern side built in the 30s. Although low-maintenance diesels were introduced 40 years prior, the workshops managed to survive on a Fred until 1999, when only 300 staff were left at the workshops, officially closing in 1992. The site today is also divided up, this time into 7 segments. Section A would be the West Block, used for heritage operations, mainly 707 and steam rail. Section B would be the Central Block, used for storage and fire services, and the Fire Service Museum workshops. Section C would be the ARHS Museum, which its purpose is in its name. Section D is the southernmost portion, and is what is referred to as the modern-day Newport workshops, housing Downer EDI Rail and Siemens workshops. Section E. This section is owned by Victrac, and they use it to store trams, accident-damaged stock, and miscellaneous railroad infrastructure. Since 2009, Alstom have also used a few roads for commissioning some of their engines. Section F would be the Tarp Shop. It's now a suburban stabling yard, built when Jolimont Workshops closed in the early 1990s. The main portion of the 1899 workshops you can see today are the central store block and the clock tower with offices, although all of this could go away. Volunteers fear for the site's future, and call for the government to extend heritage protection to about 400 more historic artifacts. They fear that the upgrades that have happened to the historic heritage listed buildings leased to Downer Rail might happen to the main workshops. That's a heavily summarized version, but future for Newport is uncertain. Based in Ballarat, the Phoenix Foundry was established in 1854, not as a locomotive builder, but as a foundry to build mining equipment. It was incorporated in the Phoenix Foundry Co. Limited in 1870. The company was established by William Shaw, moulder Robert Holden, and engine smiths Richard Carter and George Trefoil. By 1861, the foundry employed 96 men. 10 years later, the foundry completed their first locomotive, named Governor Weld. It was sent to Western Australia and was the first ever locomotive to run there. In August, the foundry managed to tender some locomotives for Victorian Railway. The first locomotive was delivered on the 27th of February 1873. The foundry soon became the most advanced in the Southern Hemisphere, until Newport was built. In 1883, the 100th loco was completed, and the 200th loco 4 years later. A problem arose in 1889, when Shaw wanted to non-unionize the shop, much to the dismay of his employees. Another issue arose when the foundry was at war with the VR's own Newport workshops for the tender with the DD460s. The Royal Commissioner, appointed in 1904, found it to be more cost-efficient to order locos from Newport, which could produce a loco for £500 cheaper than Phoenix. noting Phoenix was making a 23% profit. VR never ordered locos from the Foundry again. With Phoenix's main moneymaker lost, the company fell into liquidation. Bendigo workshops were opened in 1917, when the government wanted VR to decentralize from their main workshops at Newport, which they were just expanding into the surrounding suburbs. At the time, Ballarat and Bendigo also had rising unemployment rates due to the declining mining industry. At first, the workshops were mainly used to maintain and repair existing stock, but as time went on, 13 locos were built, 8 DD classes, and 5 A2s. A smaller workshop was built at Deniliquin in 1876 to service the Moama and Deniliquin Railway Company's stock. This workshop survived until the Moama and Deniliquin Railway was absorbed by VR in 1923. It's unknown if the machinery from the M&D's workshop was transferred over to Bendigo or not. From the 1950s onwards, when dieselization was running amok, several steam engines were sent over to Bendigo to be scrapped, at a rate of an engine every 2 to 3 weeks. The workshop was also VR's first brass foundry, whose brass operations were soon to be moved to Newport. You may think the workshops have no purpose and would have been demolished, but one of the only reasons it was keeping afloat are the VLX louver vans being constructed in 1965, at a rate of 1 per week. Springs and pantographs were also assembled made at Bendigo. The workshop employed 720 by 1966. By the 1980s, refurbishment works were being carried out on the Melbourne suburban electric units. During the 80s, VR unfortunately was privatized and was split up into several chunks, with the workshops being passed onto the State Transport Authority and then the Public Transport Corporation, and the workshops were subsequently closed, with about 300 jobs lost. In February 1996, the workshops surprisingly reopened, under a new operator of UGL Rail. Unfortunately, they vacated the site of any historic buildings in 2001. There might have been an effort to heritage list the buildings, but I haven't been able to find anything on that. In 2002, the workshops were rebuilt at a cost of $6.5 million, kindly paid for by VicTrack, the State Government Regional Infrastructure Development Fund, and the City of Greater Bendigo. The redevelopment was officially completed in 2004. Since 2009, the site has been leased to many freight operators, including Southern Short-Haul Railroad, Aurizon, GrainCorp, Metro Trains Melbourne, Pacific National, Cube Holdings, Rail First Asset, and of course, V-Line. In 2012, a couple of BRM locomotives were built, which is technically the last locomotives to be built at Bendigo. The Commage Life Extension program has also kept the workshops quite busy, as the older withdrawn Commages are sometimes sent to Bendigo to live out their final moments. As Ballarat and Bendigo were both built to decentralize Newport, they have very similar histories. They were both built in 1917. They were both used to repair and maintain stock at first, and both would build 13 locomotives, with Ballarat building 8 DDs and 5 A2s. And that's where the similarities end. By the 1960s, Ballarat was building more modern goods wagons. By the 1980s, the workshops were being used to upgrade existing suburban stock. At around the same time, the facilities were slowly being rebuilt and modernized, with 540 employees being made redundant overnight. With VR formally splitting up in the 1980s, the workshops were passed onto the State Transport Authority and then the Public Transport Corporation. just like Bendigo. With privatisation, the workshops were sold to Alstom in 1999. In 2005, Alstom sold its Australia and New Zealand operations to United Group, but leased the workshops instead of selling them off. The workshops today provide maintenance to several rail operators and employ around 150 staff. The workshops now manufacture, recondition, and overhaul components for Melbourne's trains and trams. Recently, the workshops refurbished both the Hitachi and Cummins fleets for Connex Melbourne, as well as outfitting the X-Trapless 100s and X-Trapless 2.0s, imported from the French, and constructed 61 new 100-ton grain hoppers for Rail First, formerly known as CFCL Australia. Victoria's workshops have been an essential asset to Victorian railways. Although some may not have contributed as much as others, they still built the railways we know and love today.